Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Well, I was sitting here yesterday, and of course, I had Chris firing questions at me, so I'm looking forward to the boot being on the other foot, and I actually get to ask some questions. Over the course of the last 2 days, we've heard about many, many challenges and opportunities in this sector, and almost all of them, at some level, are going to involve engaging with government, engaging with Canberra. And so this is a fantastic opportunity. Our guest this afternoon is self-proclaimed fixer, star of Kitchen Cabinet, name-checked in Upper Middle Bogan, and the new chair of COTA, Christopher Pyne. Christopher is one of Australia's most powerful, accomplished and interesting politicians. He's a power broker in the Liberal Party. He was a minister across the Howard, Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison federal governments. And he's holding portfolios including defence, industry, innovation, science, education and training. And of course, critically for us today, Minister for Ageing. Now at the time, I think it's safe to say you were the youngest Minister for Ageing, 39. Yep. And I think Annika has just taken that record from you, but you held it for a very, very long time. Now there's no door in Canberra that Christopher can't get through. Well, maybe some people on the Liberal side who he had factional battles with, but almost no door he can't get through, and runs Australia's largest Australian-owned lobbying firm. I think that's right, Pyne and Partners. So our topic this afternoon is how Canberra works. So buckle in as we go for a tour of the dark arts. Christopher, I'm ashamed to admit this, but when I was studying for Year 12, at 2 o'clock every afternoon, I would down tools and I'd turn on the ABC and I'd watch Question Time. There you go, I'm revealing a little bit of myself here. And I'd watch Question Time on the ABC every day. And it was interesting every second day when the House of Rep was on. And I love the theatre, I love the personal attacks, but tell me, is that really what Canberra's like?
Do you know, I asked one of my Senate colleagues if they still had Question Time in the Senate, because nobody watches the Senate Question Time at all, right? And I was talking to one of the senators and they said they had to go to Question Time. I said, well, do you still have Question Time in the Senate? I said, what for? I said, no one cares less about the Senate. I treated the Senate with the contempt that it richly deserved. I can tell you about that a bit later. I agreed with Paul Keating about them being the unrepresentative swill. But they take themselves very seriously, the Senate. But is that how Canberra really works? Question Time? No. Question Time is great fun. It provides an opportunity for some amateur theatrics and some thespianism. But you have to be careful saying thespianism to the National Party. They get very confused at that point. So tend not to say thespian to the National Party. But it's good fun, and look, a lot of people engage with politics through Question Time. I actually think it's very important. A lot of the hand-wringers used to say, oh, you know, people look at Question Time and think we're fighting with each other all the time, and the language can be bad, and people sort of attack each other, and, you know, we should all try and get along better. And I'd say, well, we all get along perfectly well. The point about Question Time is, and one of the things that it does which is good, is it sorts out the weak wildebeest in the pack, right? And you don't want the weak wildebeest in the pack because it can really damage the whole herd, right? So that's why the lions go after the weak wildebeest, because they think, I'm actually doing everybody a great service. And Question Time is like that as well. So if a minister can't manage Question Time, then they have really no business being in the executive government of the 11th largest economy on the globe, right? It's a very serious job. And you have to be able to know your portfolio and defend your decisions and land a blow on the other side because you want to keep them on the other side. And if you can't do that, then you will get found out. And it's not a bad thing to have the weak ministers being removed and replaced by hopefully more talented people, because that's what, and the Question Time does that, because it's so, like, you're in the full glare of everybody's attention.
So political Darwinianism.
It is, basically. It's the evolution, the survival of the fittest in a Hobbesian world. Do you know, when I first got elected at 25, and I met people like Julian McGauran, right? Yep. And Warwick Smith, right? Yes. And I'd say, I heard your maiden speeches. And they said, no one listens to maiden speeches. And Parliament wasn't even broadcast. It was only on radio. I said, but when I was doing year 12 in 1984, sadly, I would always have the radio on in the background because I need ambient noise because I'm the youngest of 5 children. I can't bear silence. You might be able to tell that. And I would have the Parliament on in the background. So I'd hear all these people speaking, and I managed to sort of do quite well in year 12. I got into medicine, but I also managed to listen to all of these mad speeches. It was Julian McGauran thought it was very exciting that anybody had listened to his maiden speech. And it was quite good, actually.
There we go. So,
he went off the rails a bit, though. You know, he rearranged his office in Melbourne so he could practice his Latin American dancing instructions. That was in the paper. And I felt like he might be a bit distracted at that point, you know. But I don't think Julian's going to trouble the scorer in terms of promotion, you know, if he's busily practicing his Latin American dancing in his office, right?
So is that why you ended up becoming a politician? Is that what kind of spurred your interest in? And probably just more broadly, just open up for us. So in order to understand Canberra, do we need to understand why do people become politicians? Why do they go into politics?
It's a very good question. I don't know anybody in politics who didn't go into politics because they wanted to make the place better. You know, it sounds like a cliche, but it's definitely true. Every politician I've ever met thought they were going to make the place better by being in politics and getting their hands on the levers of power. I went into politics because I was a classical scholar at a Jesuit school, and politics was elevated as being a very important thing to do, you know, in civil society.
A vocation.
It was a vocation. You wanted to have the best people wanting to be in power because it affects everybody's lives. I mean, we're in an industry here in aged care and seniors living. I mean, government is critical to this sector, right? And so when at school, it was elevated that if you got the opportunity to take part in our democracy, it was something to be valued. It wasn't poo-pooed like, you know, people in the media poo-poo politicians. I did get elected much earlier than I expected. And in year 10, I was given a book by a man called David, who's a craniofacial surgeon in South Australia. And my father was the ophthalmologist in the craniofacial unit. And it was about John F. Kennedy's election in 1960. It won the Pulitzer Prize. Theodore White wrote it about Kennedy versus Nixon. And I read it, and I thought it was like a textbook. You know, other people read it and thought, wow, that's kind of interesting or not. I read it and thought, that's what I have to do, you know. I'm going to do what the Kennedys did.
And what were you hoping to achieve?
Well, firstly, getting your hands on the levers of power is important, otherwise you can't achieve very much.
And once you do that?
David Pemberthy, who writes for The Australian and is a radio announcer in South Australia, I know him very well, he always used to say that people think Christopher Pyne loves the political game. But actually they're wrong. The political game, if you don't play it, you cannot get power. And you can't do anything without power, right? So all these people who want to be independents and crossbenchers and think they're changing the world, it's very nice, it's a democracy, they can do that if they wish to. But at the end of the day, they're not going to make decisions, right, about how we govern ourselves. They're either going to frustrate other people's decisions or they're going to simply support other people's decisions. So I went into politics to make a difference, to make the country better, to get power in order to be able to do that. And look, I was obviously very fortunate because that's how it came to pass. And it doesn't for a lot of people in politics. They don't ever end up getting anywhere.
So you mentioned the media there. And obviously the relationship with the media is interesting. And of course, a little fact for this conference. So Laurie Oakes, I have it on very, very good authority that Laurie Oakes is about to move into a retirement village. So if you kind of want evidence that the boomers are upon us, Laurie Oakes is about to move into a retirement village. So there's this strange symbiotic relationship between politicians and the media.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about that. What's the dynamic? How does it play out? What does it cause people to do and not do? And
well, I used to always describe the media and the Australian politicians as being like that small bird that sits on the top of the hippopotamus, you know, and cleans its insects off and things, you know. It's just that we couldn't work out who was the hippopotamus and who was the bird. Right? The relationship between the hippopotamus and the bird is critical, right, to the hippopotamus's survival. And the journalists and politicians are exactly the same. They have a total symbiotic relationship. And the media are there to be harnessed. You know, you can have the best message in the world, but if no one ever hears it, it's pointless, isn't it?
So most people are not listening to ABC radio of Parliament?
No. A politician with a really good message that no one's ever heard is like the sound of one hand clapping, isn't it? So the media are very important to getting the message out. But a lot of politicians and people in business are terrified of the media, right? And now that I've been out of politics for 5 years, which is incredible when you think about it, in April it's 5 years, it's gone very quickly, I've noticed that business doesn't really have any concept of how the media can be our friends. The media can also not be our friends, right? I mean, you and I have been in the media, and they can be really awful, but they're going to be much worse if you don't ring them back, right? And they're going to be much worse if you don't give them anything at all. It's better to engage with the press and try and explain to them why they're wrong about something. I mean, it's not very hard to say to the press, this is all on background, or this is completely off the record. But I'll give you a couple of lines as well, but rather than just going straight into it, you know, I'll explain something to you, and then I'll give you the lines, because you need a line for your story, right? And I need to make sure the story isn't wrong, and they don't want it to be wrong. Most journalists don't want to write wrong things. So you've got to use the media as a tool of politics, and you are their subject, so you're just as important to them. And so politicians that think I'm really clever because I've never been quoted in the press, you think, well, you're in the wrong job, right? Because your job is to promote the government's agenda. And maybe your own agenda. Like when you're a backbencher, you know, it's smart to be in the media saying interesting things about policy issues. Obviously not attacking your own party. I would never be responsible for background against any of my colleagues.
Of course not.
But although some people do. But it is useful to... and there's that great saying that Laurie Brereton used to say in politics, where there's death, there's hope. I
think Chris Pyne is going to use that as the theme for next year's conference.
Where there's death, there's hope. Because if somebody died, everybody got promoted. So everybody wanted the politicians who were above them to go, you know. The only politician who's truly happy in Canberra is the Prime Minister. Because they've reached the top of the ladder.
It's all down from there.
Everybody else is trying to get there.
So the other part of the kind of the symbiotic relationship in Canberra, the bureaucrats. We have to be careful because I think we'll get at least one public servant here. I think there are a few more in the room. So how important are the bureaucrats, or the public servants? Be careful. How important are they?
Well, they're very, very important, and they also need to be harnessed too, right? I mean, we're all pulling the same chariot, you know. The public servants are our friends in politics. You know, I've never been frightened of my bureaucrats, but you have to be, if you want to be in power, this is the problem with all these ICACs and NACs, actually, which we'll get to. I mean, there's nothing wrong with transparency. Who doesn't love transparency? But it has changed the dynamic in governments because some ministers, especially inexperienced new ministers, are so frightened of not doing exactly what the public servant's recommendation is in case they get accused of doing something for the wrong reason, that it's actually changing the dynamic of the Westminster system because the minister is supposed to make the decision. And the minister is supposed to bring their judgment to that decision. And if they don't agree with the recommendation from the public servant, they're supposed to make the decision that they think is correct, not what the public servant has told them to do, right? And I think the problems with the NACs and the ICACs and everything is that they're so frightened, the politicians, that they don't want to ever step outside that zone. And that means that the public servant's getting all the power. And the other problem with that is that the public servants, the ministers, don't take advice from anybody outside the public service. And one of the things you have to do when you're a minister or a politician is talk to lots of different people. I mean, one of the first things that they say to you in the Defence Department is you can't talk to anybody in defence industry. And you say, that's not right. And they say, no, probity, minister. I said, no, that's wrong. Probity means I have to give company A, who's bidding for a project, as much time as company B and company C. And if I visit BAE's stand at the Indo-Pac for 20 minutes, I have to visit Navantia's stand for 20 minutes. That's what probity means. It means giving everybody a fair go. It doesn't mean you can't speak to anybody, right? So the public servants do have a habit of trying to cut people off from other sources, and that's bad, because often when I was in politics, I'd say to the public servant, why aren't we doing X, Y, and Z? And they'd know that I'd spoken to somebody outside the pool of approved people, right? But, of course, you also can't do anything if you don't work with your public service. The bureaucracy, most of them are very, very professional. They know that their job is to implement the government's policies, even if they don't like it. And if they don't like it, they can leave, right? Which they very rarely do. But they either just do a go slow or whatever. But they mostly will do exactly what you ask them to do, because that's their job. And they're very professional people, especially at the senior levels of the bureaucracy. So I think the public service is there to be part of, the team government. That's what governments do. You have ministers who make decisions, you have public servants that implement them, you have the media which tells people what those decisions are, and if you're smart, you harness the industry that you're in the portfolio who deliver the services or the products, because then you hear important things that you might want to do.
So, other than engaging Pyne and Partners, what advice would you give to the people in this room for engaging with these folks in Canberra, the politicians, media, bureaucrats? How do we, as citizens, as people in this industry, actually productively engage?
Well, the bit of advice I've always given to everybody, even new clients now since I've been out of politics, is give the government what they want, right? A lot of businesses used to come and see us, and even now in my new roles as a chairman of various things and public Pyne and Partners, as businesses turn up and they say, we think the government should do this. And the question is, has the government asked us for that? They said, no, but the government should do it. You say, well, okay, but the government is the one with the money, yes, and the government's the one with the power, yes. Well, they want to do what they want to do. So my strong advice is, let's find out what the government wants to do, and then let's fit ourselves into that, lane, and then we're going to have a lot more success. Because otherwise, we're turning up saying, we think you should do it this way, and the minister thinks, but we're not doing it that way. So why am I wasting my time talking to this person? And like in defence, this is very prevalent, because everybody's an armchair expert about the nation's national security, right? And so you will often have clients or businesses that you meet in the course of your daily life who say, the government's put out a tender for, 6 ships or something. Yes, but they're wrong. Right, okay. The tender, they've written the tender wrongly, because they should actually do it this way. And you need to go and tell them. I'd say no. The government has spent a lot of time with that tender, and the public servants who've written it have spent months probably, or longer, putting it all together. And they're not interested in the person who turns up and says, this is all wrong. You have to start all over again, just because that's what you want them to do. We have to work out what they want to do, and then we need to fit in to them, and then you can change it later. One of the Canberra diseases is never making a decision. One of the great things about Malcolm Turnbull was he always used to say, let's make a decision. If we get it wrong, we can always change it later. But if we never make a decision, we never do anything, right? And it's the same as responding to government requests for action, whatever the action might be. Try and get into the room, get around the table, win the project. Later on, you can always change it. But my advice would be, listen to what the government's asking you for rather than broadcasting to them.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful advice. So you, over your career, managed to get a lot of things done inside Canberra. And so you know how to get things done, and conversely, you know how to stop things happening. Do you want to tell us about how you as a minister got things done, and importantly, how to stop things happening that you didn't like?
Well, the best way, to get things done, you have to make a decision, right? And you want the flattest structure possible between you and the decision. So you want, conversely, if you don't want to do something, you create as many hurdles as possible between you and the decision being made. And the best method is to set up an interdepartmental committee. As soon as you hear the phrase interdepartmental committee, you know that the government's not making a decision. Right?
I once worked for a minister. Whenever you'd use the phrase whole of government,
yes.
He would ask me, is that with or without the W, Simon?
Yes, so the interdepartmental committee is usually the best method of stopping anything happening. And all the other ministers will want to be in on that. Right. The best way to get something done is to pay for it. The great thing about defence is that we had lots of money. Right? And so sometimes if I was in a room with other ministers who were giving me their free advice about how we were going to do something, I would say, and now tell me, how much is your department putting up for that? They said, oh, we haven't got any money. I said, no, you haven't. I said, well, I have. I say, I've got a lot of money. So I get to make the decisions. It's very nice that you've wanted to come and give me your advice, and I don't mind putting the office in your department so that you save face. But since we're paying, we're deciding what to do. It's like father of the bride, you know. Actually, fathers of the bride never get to decide what to do, now that I think about it. It's more like the bride. The bride. It's more like the bride. So getting things done is about being prepared to make a decision and take a risk. It's a problem in government. I mean, you've been in state government and you've been across national affairs. It is a Canberra and Macquarie Street problem that if you don't make a decision, you can't get sacked. But actually, you don't also get anything done. And if you want to leave a legacy, you have to get things done. Finding the bureaucrats who are doers is really important, and not all of them are. Yes. Thanking them a lot when they do something good. I remember once when the CASG head, Kim Gillis, he rang me and said, we'll do the offshore patrol vessel tender in October. I said, good. So then he rang me about a month before that and said, remember how I told you we were going to get that done in October? And I said, yes. He said, well, we're not going to. I said, but you promised you would. He said, yes, but we're just not going to get it done. I said, well, you have to get it done. He said, why? Is there something happening? I said, yes. You promised me you'd get it done. So October 31, it went up on the internet. So he got it done. So I said, let's have a party. He said, what for? I said, to celebrate. So where? He said. I said, at Russell Hill. He said, we don't have parties on Russell Hill. I said, well, we're going to have one. I said, get the offshore patrol vessel team together who got the tender out and we'll have a drinks party. So we turned up at 5 o'clock and me in my office, and there were like sort of 30 or 40 pale bureaucrats there. They don't seem to let them out in the sun on Russell Hill. And I thought, oh, okay, never mind. They all wanted to go home probably. It was 5 o'clock. But anyway, we're there at 5:15, and there are about sort of 40 people in the room. And I said, I'd like a glass of white wine, please. And they said, we don't have any alcohol here. I said, what? They said, no, we can't have any drinks here. We never have drinks on Russell Hill. I said, don't be absurd. You can't have a party without a drink. I said, this isn't a Lutheran event. I said, this is... I once went to a wedding with Amanda Vanstone. It was Lutheran, and there was no alcohol. Imagine how well that went. Amanda and I think we were home by 9 p.m. But anyway, I said, well, that's not going to happen. I said, we have to have a drink. They said, well, there's no alcohol up here. So I said to my staff, I said, hop in the car and go back to my office and bring some wine, which they did. And we all had wine and we celebrated and everybody was very happy and I thanked them all for their thing. And they're all saying, this has never happened before. No one's ever thanked us before. I said, well, this is the problem, right? You've got to, people do a good job. You've got to pat them on the back and say, thanks, that's great. And then they worked much harder next time, right? Because I think he appreciates us. So getting things done in Canberra is no different to getting things done in your business. You know, you try and surround yourself with good people. You trust the team. You reward them when they do a good job. And the first thing you have to do is be prepared to take a risk and make a decision.
Now, you were Minister for Defence, so you had a lot of money. Yes. But of course, Minister for Ageing or Minister for Aged Care today, sort of half-time, Minister for Sport with the other half her time, doesn't have a lot of money.
Well, she says she doesn't have any money. They always start that way.
Well, she's got to go and ask. She's got to go and ask Minister Butler.
I was actually a bit shocked when I was in government at how little money some people did have.
So does that change things? Like, how do you work with someone like Annika, where she's got to go off to Mark Butler and off to the Expenditure Review Committee? That sounds quite Orwellian. You can maybe explain what that is. How do you work with someone like Annika to help Annika achieve what she wants to achieve, right, per your advice, when she doesn't have the same sort of massive checkbook that the Defence Minister might? It's
a really, really big question, right? There's so many different ways to answer that question, because aged care or ageing is there can be plenty of money in aged care if the government wants a problem to go away, right? There's plenty of money in aged care if consumers pay for the value of what they receive. And let's go on. Let's get back to that, right? But in terms of money, the ERC. So I regarded the ERC as an impertinence, and so I treated them with the contempt they also richly deserved. And I remember at one ERC meeting, because I was leader of the House, right? So I was in the leadership group for 10 years, and the more senior you get, you know, I don't like being told I can't have this and I can't have that when I was in the leadership group. So I remember one meeting of the ERC, and Matthias was the Minister for Finance, who runs the ERC, and he was sitting on the other side of the table, and I was looking at them, you know, with cold eyes because I didn't want to be there. And Matthias was going through the Greens, and I said, I've actually got some good news, Matthias. He said, what's that? I said, I found $600 million in the defence budget that hasn't been spent. He said, well, that's good. He said, that can come back to the government. I said, no, that's Defence's money. And he said, isn't Defence part of the government? And I just laughed. I didn't even respond. I thought, what a ridiculous question. But in terms of coming back to the more serious issue, look, everything is about political will. So you might remember when Julie Bishop was the Minister for Ageing, yes, who was two before me, because I took over from Santoro. Howard wanted to solve a problem in aged care because the providers, probably quite correctly, were saying that they couldn't really provide the services, the costs that they were being given by the government.
Nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed, and they suddenly came up with hundreds of millions of dollars, if you remember rightly, as some kind of supplement. I think they called it a supplement, or it wasn't really a bonus. They wouldn't have called it a bonus, but I think they called it a supplement. And that patched that leak, you know, but it didn't solve the problem. And when I was the Minister for Ageing, because we were coming into the election that we lost, I call my period in ageing the golden age of the Howard government. It was 9 months. But my job was to keep ageing out of the news, right? Yes. But aged care is always a barnacle for governments who think they don't want to spend any money on it because it's so expensive. No government, Labor or coalition, has been prepared to actually tackle the real issue around funding in aged care, which is why is it that at that stage of people's lives, and I'm the chairman of COTA, of course, so I'm very interested in these issues, why is it at that stage of people's lives, people who are living longer, more healthy, going into aged care later, so they might have a longer period in a seniors independent living, whatever it might be. But why is it in our country we've decided that the government doesn't pay people's rents for them, the government doesn't pay people's mortgages for them, but somehow when you go into aged care, the government's suddenly supposed to provide you with your accommodation, right? And that is not a good policy parameter. People should pay for the value of what they receive. I mean, private schools charge differential fees, you know? It's not like every private school charges the same fee and you're not allowed to charge any more. And of course the lefties don't want any private schooling, but that's not going to happen in this country. But the Greens don't want private schooling, but we have private schooling. Same thing for private health insurance, you know. And yet but surprisingly in aged care, we've developed this notion that people shouldn't be able to be charged for the value of what they're receiving.
Right. So you hit 65 and all of a sudden you're transported to, you know, Cuba.
Exactly. It is a bit like socialism. Because obviously there should be government-provided aged care for people who can't afford aged care, right? And that's the way our society has always worked. But for people who have significant resources and are quite prepared to pay, right, they're not really allowed to. I mean, everyone bends themselves out of shape trying to create all sorts of different quality things so that they can charge more money. And one of the important measures of successful regulation is it's so complicated that it's actually mitigating against the outcomes it's trying to achieve. Right? And I feel like in aged care, that's exactly what's been happening for a very long time. But it's a very thorny political issue because while this might be controversial, but while I'm sure that many older people with resources are prepared to pay more for their aged care, their children or nephews or nieces or whomever it might be don't want to be paying more for their aged care, right? Because they can see the end of the tunnel. You know, and
where there's death, there's hope.
You know, so that might be controversial. I would never have said that when I was a member of Parliament, I must say, but I'm sure, but there's obviously a divergence of interests when people are in their 90s about how much they're prepared to spend and how much their nephews, nieces, or children might be wanting them to spend.
All right, so Chair of COTA, you were Minister for Ageing. What do you think the answer is? What's the solution in aged care?
Well, I believe in the market, and I believe that there should be a safety net for people who can't afford quality accommodation in their older life. But I do think that the government, any government, whether it's a Labor government or a coalition government, needs to take the brakes off aged care and treat the funding of it like any other part of the economy.
So a classic Australian policy solution.
Well, you'd think so.
Strong safety net, but let people have what they want if they're willing to pay.
Well, I couldn't agree more, right? So that's what your idea is. I'm going to blame you. I'm going to say Simon Miller said it. And that would be true, but it wouldn't be the total truth, because I also said it. That's part of the trick of answering the questions in question time, you know. We always have to tell the truth.
As Chair of COTA, you know, obviously you preside over a complex federation.
I do.
And they may not completely agree with you on this.
I'm sure they don't, no. But there's only so much money in the economy. There's only so much money in government. And this is an age-old discussion. Quality aged care, the task force which came out, last week? It's gone through exactly the same arguments. We all want quality aged care, but someone has to pay for it. And whether the Albanese government will want to bite that bullet, I don't think so. They haven't given any indication of that. The fact that they didn't release their response at the same time as the task force report is not as bad as setting up an interdepartmental committee, but it's kind of...
It's the second best option.
It's the second best option. So, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball on what the government will do on that front. But I mean, from an in-principle point of view, I believe that those people who want to pay more should be able to pay more, and they shouldn't be... The aged care providers shouldn't be so straitjacketed that they can't do that. I mean, you have to have good regulation. I mean, aged care today is nothing like aged care even 5 years ago or 10 years ago, certainly 25 years ago, you know. And that's part of the marketing in the media. So the more good media we can do in this sector about how fantastic the offering is, which is actually fantastic, yes, and globally world-leading. Sorry, that was a tautology. It's world-leading. The less people are going to have this sort of Dickensian view of people in aged care, which probably was like that when I first got elected in 1993. Not all aged care was as good as other aged care.
And then the golden age of the Howard government there was a step change. Yeah.
But the regulatory regime that we now have in place around standards, I think, is very, very good. And I think pretending it isn't is wrong. And I think, you know, insisting that the government pay for everything the Australian voters would be quite prepared for people to pay more.
And so bipartisan solutions, something that, you know, you hear the community talk about, it pops up in the media. In fact, I think I've heard both Annika Wells and Anne Ruston talk about bipartisanship and willing to engage. Do you think that's code for the task force maybe does have a future? There may be actually a positive response to this? Do you think there's
the task force was well crafted? I think the report was well crafted. Will oppositions ever give the government an even break on aged care? Look, there are enough people in the coalition with experience of this sector to understand that is necessary. It all very much depends on the reaction of the voters. If the opposition sees that there's a significant group of people who are angry with the government about something, it's not the opposition's job to say you shouldn't be angry with the government about that. You know, it's a good idea. It doesn't happen. That doesn't happen, right? It's up to, and I wouldn't expect the opposition to do that. Even if they were Labor, I wouldn't expect them to do it. The reality is the government has to take a decision, has to lead on it, and try and sell it. Now, there were 7 ministers of the ageing in the Howard government. Julie and I are the only 2 that really survived. Judy Moylan tried to tackle funding of aged care. But I remember when we introduced the bonds, right? But there was no interest. And I remember thinking, in fact saying, as a sort of young Liberal MP, but won't the value of money change over time? And therefore, isn't that why we allow people to charge interest? Because it means they can keep up with the changing of the value of money. And this was regarded as heresy to say such a thing, because they thought it was hard enough introducing the bonds without introducing it. But I noticed the task force just said that should be changed.
Well, in fact,
20 years later.
Take the money off the bonds, off the RADs under the task force. So that's a good outcome for the sector.
If it happens.
If it happens. If it happens. It's time to wrap up.
Yes, thank you.
Best line you've ever delivered in Parliament? Self-rated, self-assessed.
I delivered a lot of good lines.
I know. That's why this is a hard question. I kept the hardest question until last.
I think there was, when Anthony was the leader of the opposition, he was the managed opposition business and Bill was the leader of the opposition. Anthony went out and gave a speech at Bathurst, you know, because the Labor people did this Bathurst speech thing. And I held the speech up in the chamber and said, this is a speech, this is a knife a bloodied knife masquerading as a speech delivered by the leader of the managed opposition business to plunge into Bill Shorten, which of course, as it came to pass, is exactly what happened. And Richard Miles is a particular friend, right? But he's a very, very nice person, as well as being a particular friend. And he's a lot of fun to make fun of because he can't stop laughing at himself when you tease him. And he had been to, he'd been in a fight with Adam Somyurek. Yes. Like literally in the parliamentary dining room of the Victorian Parliament on Spring Street. But it was so sad that they had a fight with butter knives, right? And I think I said something like that I would back the member for Corio in a butter knife fight any day. Can you imagine little butter knives? What are they doing with the butter knife? What were they doing for it? They're grown men. Isn't that insane? And Richard almost died laughing. He was a lot of fun. He is a lot of fun still.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in thanking Christopher Pyne.
Oh, you thought I was going to say my gin and tonic line.
I thought you were going to say the gin and tonic line, but...
Can I say that line now?
You can say the gin and tonic line.
So I did just to finish up, because I know you've all got more important people to listen to, but I was doing my valedictory speech, which was when I leave Parliament, and of course I didn't want to do one because I knew I'd never make it through without weeping endlessly. But fortunately it was very short, and it was only 8 minutes, and I practiced it over and over and over again. I wrote it myself. I never speak from notes. I almost always speak off the cuff. But I thought I have to have the speech in front of me in case I go right off the rails. And I practiced it over and over again after question time with my staff, and I was constantly crying through the speech, right? And my chief of staff said, maybe we should take out the bits where you get emotional. I said, it's the whole speech. But anyway, so I'm up there, and I'm doing the speech, and it's going pretty well. So I thought, oh, this is going pretty well. So I got to the point where I said that I didn't have a log cabin story, right? Because a log cabin, Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Kentucky, right? And so it's become synonymous with the people who've, lifted themselves up from the bootstraps, and everyone apparently has to have a log cabin story. I can't understand why anybody wants to be born in a log cabin, quite frankly. So I've never had a log cabin story, but I'm an old noblesse oblige liberal, right? So I don't care. I just want to make other people's lives better, and I want them to have the same opportunities I've had. But obviously I've been a very lucky person, right? So I was at that point where I said, I've not got a log cabin story, unlike the leader of the opposition, that Anthony Albanese has got a proper log cabin story. I said, although I did once have to get my own lemon for a gin and tonic. And that was the only spontaneous part of the entire speech. I had written the whole thing out carefully, so I'd get from one end to the other, and then I think I'll go off script. And everybody loved it. They laughed and laughed and laughed. I suppose it is a bit self-deprecating. And I said, I don't think that counts, though, as a log cabin story. I also had to dust, my own salt off peanuts at the club once. Anyway, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.